Good evening. My name is Melissa Giller, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. Thank you all for joining me tonight. In honor of our men and women around the world who defend our freedom, can I ask if you could please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Alan Turing was an extraordinary man. In his short 42 years of life, he accomplished more successes than most people accomplish in a lifetime twice that long. He was a mathematician, a biologist, a computer scientist, a code breaker, a war hero. But still his name was not really a household name. Then Benedict Cumberbatch played Alan Turing, winning an Oscar in 2014's The Imitation Game. Suddenly, a wide audience became acquainted with the work of the code breakers in England's famous Bletchley Park. The film honors his role as one of the principal figures at Britain's top secret government code and cipher school during the darkest days of World War II. Did The Imitation Game's portrayal of Alan Turing show the real man? That's what Dermot Turing, nephew of Alan Turing, will discuss with us tonight. Dermot's new book draws on newly released secret documents, previously undisclosed letters, the family's own archives, and interviews with Alan Turing's friends and colleagues. In a recent op-ed, Dermot wrote, and I quote, "I sadly never had the opportunity to meet my uncle, Alan Turing. We share some very basic similarities. We both attended Sherborne and King's College, Cambridge. Both have an affinity for mathematics. Both have ties to Bletchley Park. But that's about it. I couldn't possibly claim to have achieved anything in the realm of what he did, but nevertheless, I've always considered my relation to him a tremendous source of pride." End quote. I've had the honor of introducing many people here at the Reagan Library, but I have to admit that tonight is the first time I get to introduce a Sir. So ladies and gentlemen, Sir Dermot Turing.
Well, thank you very much for such a warm welcome. It's a great privilege to be here. And I have to say it's been a very interesting experience to be shown around the Reagan Presidential Library today, and I enjoyed that very much. Okay, so I'm not going to talk to you about Ronald Reagan. I'm going to talk to you about Alan Turing. As you can see from this slide, that's a picture of Benedict Cumberbatch. That's a picture of Alan Turing. We all know Alan Turing now because Benedict's acting is pretty good. And the consequence of that is that the mental picture, I think, that we all carry around of Alan Turing is probably the one created by Benedict Cumberbatch. And so what I wanted really to do today is just to peel back, if you like, behind the Hollywood gloss and see if we can try and find out a little bit more about the real Alan Turing. So you might look at it, I think Alan Turing's life story is a Shakespearean story. I think it's a Shakespearean tragedy. And Shakespearean tragedies are in 5 acts, aren't they, normally? So I thought what I would do is look at Alan Turing's life in 5 myths, and we can see if we can turn the 5 myths into a Shakespearean tragedy in 5 facts. So I thought I'd start with the myth of Alan Turing's childhood, which doesn't really get covered in the movie. But this might interest you because my grandparents were part of the British Empire. My grandfather worked for the Indian Civil Service, and he spent his professional career in the Madras province in the south of India, where my father was born in 1908. So you can see there's a picture of my father as a very young child with my grandmother, and he's on the Rani Sahib's pony. And I think that was a particular treat for him, aged not quite 1, to be allowed on the back of the Rani Sahib's pony. And you can see there's a sort of bearer there, standing holding the pony. So this sets a bit of a scene because those of you who have friends in the armed forces or relatives in the armed forces know about overseas postings, and it's very difficult, particularly in the early 20th century when communications were not as rapid as they are now. It took a month to get home for long leave. So overseas postings were challenging for families with children. So the tradition for those working for the Indian Civil Service, and indeed in other colonial postings, was that the parents had to find essentially a foster home for the children. So when my father was 4 and my grandmother was pregnant for the second time with the child that was going to be Alan, they decided that they would come back to Britain and find a foster home for the boys so that they could grow up in a home environment while my grandparents went back to India to do the job that they were being paid to do. So this is where the first myth comes from, that Alan Turing, being deprived of a family background, had the most miserable imaginable childhood and then turned into this strange asocial geek that you may or may not have met when you watched the movie. I'm not sure this is actually fair. I think it's probably rather unfair to my grandmother. Okay, her taste in hats for taking the children to the beach was perhaps slightly unusual, but I think it's a great hat. It's a great hat. It's a great picture. My father's hat, the one on the right, is sort of slightly strange as well. But that's kind of what you wore to the beach in 1913. And there's Alan sitting there looking, I think, slightly grumpy. But there we are. He's about 1 there. And the great thing is that my grandmother managed to find a very good foster home for the boys to live in. Now, John was uprooted, my father was uprooted from what he was used to, but that doesn't mean that Alan had a bad time, because he'd known nothing else, essentially, than the foster family that he grew up with. And they were a friendly, it was a military family, but, it was kind of a good place to grow up. He was allowed to sort of be who he was. And I think first myth exploded, actually. So what's the second myth? Let's pick up the story when Alan's at Sherborne School. Again, there's a scene from the movie up there, and it actually really does look like that. I mean, that's the main courts at Sherborne, where you can see the school library in the top right-hand corner of the slide. Uniforms aren't like that anymore, but and you can see in the bottom picture, that's the boarding house, Westcott House, where both Alan and I lived for the 5 years that we were each at Sherborne. Behind that rather ugly fire escape, in fact, there was an American serviceman who was posted for some reason to Sherborne during World War II, and he saw this building and he said, "That must be the town penitentiary." No, actually, it's a boarding house from the school. But anyway, never mind. It does look like a town penitentiary, but you can see the window at the bottom, just to the left of the fire escape. That was my study, and the one on the opposite side of the corridor, which you can't see because it's obscured by the fire escape and a bush, but in a contemporary photograph from the 1920s, you can see it, and the window on the other side of the building was Alan's. He looked out over the garden, I looked out over the road, but anyway, there we go. But so it was we did share this sort of common experience of being educated in the same school and living in the same house. Oh, it's strange, but okay. So, what is the second myth about Alan's time? Well, if you've watched The Imitation Game, you will see there's a bullying scene. That's a piece of what we call artistic license. The reason the school was chosen for Alan was that my father had a rotten time at Marlborough, which is a different private boarding school in the UK. He said to his parents, "Don't send Alan to Marlborough because he will not survive the experience." So they looked around. Again, they looked around for a school which had, and this was very unusual for private schools in the first part of the 20th century, to depart from the classical tradition where Latin and rugby and more Latin and more rugby and occasional smattering of Greek was considered to be the education. They looked around for a school where they were allowed to do something called science. And so Sherborne was a good school because they actually had a thriving science department, and again, Alan fitted in quite well there. So you get this piece of mythology that comes from various pieces of literature and also from the movie, I think to perhaps lesser extents, that Alan's life was shaped by a relationship he'd formed with another boy at school called Christopher Morecambe, and that this powerful sort of crush or whatever it is he'd had on this other boy, who then subsequently died very early, was somehow a lodestar for Alan's life. I have to say I don't buy this myth at all, and I'll just give you a couple of bits of evidence that this photograph on the right of the slide was taken about 6 months after Christopher Morecambe died. That's clearly not Christopher Morecambe, therefore, in the photo with Alan. It's another one of his friends, a chap called Murmagen, who's another maths student. They don't exactly look miserable, do they, in that picture? They don't. And again, roughly at the same time, the Sherborne School Archives turned out this thing. Okay, let me start with the photo. That thing, you can see there's a chair in the photo, and there's a thing that looks like a loo brush sitting on the chair. This is what the classics master used as, what shall we say, an incentive to help the delinquent students improve their Latin. And this is Alan Turing's first mathematical formula, first published mathematical formula. It dates from when he was just after Christopher Morecambe had died again. And it's all about how a Latin student can work out how many credits he's going to get in his public examinations, which are very important to pass, because you don't get into Oxford or Cambridge unless you passed your Latin exam. It's very important that all the kids pass this exam. And C is the number of credits that will be obtained. M is the weight of boy in pounds. Capital M is the momentum of bonzo. So that's the loo brush. Okay, so the momentum of bonzo on impact with the hindquarters of the boy at the last application of the same, and so forth. And then theta is the angle of inclination of the body at the last application of bonzo, and R is the number of ice buns eaten per week in break, and so forth. I mean, you know, this is kind of not a depressed kid, is it? So I mean, and it's also not a humourless kid, and it's not somebody who doesn't have any friends. So I think this is all quite interesting, finding out a little bit more about Alan Turing and his early life. Okay, I'm now going to fast forward to Alan's academic career. So he left Sherborne and went to King's College, Cambridge, where he studied mathematics and ended up, after a shaky start, with a decent quality degree, and then he was allowed to stay on and do a postgraduate year of sort of quasi-research coupled with study, a bit like a master's, but sort of not quite as formalised as that. And he was taught by the chap on the left, a chap called Max Newman, who had a very powerful influence throughout the whole of Alan Turing's professional life. So he first meets they first meet each other in Max Newman's lecture room in about 1934-35, and Max Newman is lecturing on the fundamental rules that underpin mathematics. And I won't go into the detail of it because otherwise we'll be here all night, but the point is that he describes the possible way of solving this unanswered theorem in mathematics as whether you could devise a mechanical process that you could apply to any mathematical theorem to know whether it was provable or not. Whether you could prove a theorem, is there a mechanical process that you could apply? And this phrase, the mechanical process, sparked Alan Turing's imagination, almost to the point where he's really annoyed that lady in the street in Guildford there. And he writes this seminal paper, and any of you who've had the misfortune to study computer science will have been forced by your professors to have read this paper called On Computable Numbers and Applications to the Scheidungs Problem, because this is the one that sets out the blueprint in 1936 for a universal computing machine. Now, we don't think there's anything remarkable about universal computing machines. What do I mean by a universal computing machine? I mean a machine that can do more than one job. Okay, if you have a mixer in your kitchen, it is there to do mixing. You cannot ask it to make the toast. You cannot ask it to boil water. It is a mixer. Okay, and all computing machinery was essentially the same idea. It was all single function machinery. So Alan Turing had this idea that you could have a multi-purpose machine, and you changed its function by having a thing called a program, or as he called it, a set of instruction tables that would tell it what to do and thereby change what it was actually doing. Unbelievable for 1936, and it was a very theoretical idea, but here we have the seeds of all the stuff that he did for the rest of his career, and it was all planted by this man, Newman. So myth number 3 is that Alan Turing's brilliant ideas sprung into his head sort of completely formed and they came out of the ether. No, they didn't. They came like everybody else's ideas. We've all had good ideas in our lifetimes, and they've usually come from having conversations with somebody, and it's just sparked off some thought process in our own mind. So Newman deserves a lot of credit because he is the man that provided sparks throughout the whole of Alan Turing's career. I'll come back to some more of those later on. Okay, so here he is in King's College, Cambridge, and it's 1936, and he's written this paper, and guess what? It's like the journalist's worst nightmare. His paper is just about to go off to be published, and Max Newman opens his mail and discovers that there's some nasty American guy who has published basically the same idea in an American journal. I mean, how bad is that? You know, scooped by the Yanks. Oh, God. Okay, so actually, in mathematics, we're all very polite to each other. So, in fact, that's not the reaction he gives. And he says to Alan Turing, why don't you go and study for a year or so with Professor Church at Princeton? He's the guy that scooped you, and then you put two great minds together, and that would be a good thing. So Alan Turing spent 2 years at Princeton, and I mean, he came back, and he wrote some completely impossible to understand papers while he was there, by the way. But when he comes back to the UK in 1938, of course, you know what the political climate's like. The reason he didn't stay in the United States, even though he'd been offered a job here, was because everybody knew that the country was going to go to war, and he thought that his place belonged back at home. So he comes back to King's to sort of pick up his research career, but then he is introduced over the King's high table to this thing, the Enigma machine. And very secretly in 1938 he is starting to work on whether there is a mathematical or possibly mechanical method. So we're putting this idea of maths and machinery together to possibly find a solution to getting behind the Enigma machine. And that's all very interesting because it's a long time before the war has broken out, so they've started involving him on this particular problem. Now, you may be asking yourself why there are these peculiar photos in this picture. You've got the Enigma machine. We understand why that's there, but what about that weird thing in the bottom left-hand corner? That's the only known photograph of the man who recruited Alan Turing for Bletchley Park. And it's a photograph taken in the front court of King's College, Cambridge, where the British weather is doing the thing that it is most famous for, and it's been doing for the last 4 months, which is why I'm here and escaping it. And that's Professor Frank Adcock. He's the talent agent, and he's sheltering from the rain, and also, because he's a spy, he's sheltering from having his photograph taken. So that's all very interesting. And the building behind it is where Alan Turing's rooms were, on the top floor looking out over the river, really rather attractive. Okay, so he starts working on the Enigma problem. Of course, war breaks out in 1939, and he is mobilised and sent to Bletchley Park, this Victorian mansion described again by a US serviceman who was posted to Bletchley Park in 1943 as a maudlin and monstrous pile. This chap was an architect during his peacetime career, and so he was qualified to judge. But anyway, so a maudlin and monstrous pile. Anyway, Alan Turing didn't work in the mansion, the maudlin and monstrous pile. He worked in the stable yard in the cottages there, so the buildings on the right-hand side of the slide, and that's where he came up with possibly his most famous invention of World War II. Later on, he was put into the wooden huts that they built when they grown out of the brick-built buildings there, and that's Hut 8, which is where naval intelligence was, and that's where Alan Turing was working during the war. Come and visit. Come and see these places for yourself. We're open to the public. 40 minutes from London. Take the train from Euston Station. You do not need to drive. Okay, his most famous invention of World War II. That's weird. This guy's put 1939 on the top of that thing. We know, we saw the movie, we know that it took the entire year, and it was only in the nick of time, 20 seconds before the D-Day landings, that suddenly the machine, which was called Christopher, came to life, and actually you fed the Enigma intercepts in one end and out spewed intelligence, and then we knew that we could divert convoys in the Atlantic. Well, kind of, sort of, a bit, but actually this machine, the bomb, which is the thing that found the settings on the Enigma machine, didn't actually do the decoding for you. It offered suggestions as to how the machine had been set up. He had actually completed his invention of this thing by 1939, Christmas 1939. So the prototype was delivered around about Easter time 1940. Don't forget the Germans didn't invade France until May of 1940. So essentially the machine is up and running very early in the war, and it's starting to spew out useful suggestions for settings which enabled real decoding to happen by the autumn of 1940, by the time of the Battle of Britain. So actually that raises a whole difficult question about what was Alan Turing spending the rest of the war doing? Okay, so if he'd done these sort of like big beast project, and he'd done it by Christmas of the first year of the war, what on earth did he spend? Well, there were a lot of other code-breaking challenges, so he wasn't doing nothing for the rest of the war. But essentially by late 1942, they were looking around for a different role for him, and this has been clothed in secrecy for many years, what he was actually doing then. And it starts off when actually he was sent to the US. So there's this rather strange building, which is actually in Manhattan. It still looks like that because my wife and I went to have a look at it in November, and it really does still look like that. The trains don't run through the bottom of it anymore. This was Bell Labs, and this was where the US Army was making its own bombs for the machine that was finding the settings on the Enigma machine. So they were actually making their bombs in this building. So Alan Turing was sent there to check out whether the things were going according to plan. And also he was sent to check out an American machine that was designed to encipher speech, so that when, for example, Roosevelt and Churchill were having their telephone conversations going on by radio telephone, which had for the first 3 years of the war been listened into quite happily by the Germans because they weren't being securely enciphered, getting a sensible encipherment machine that would enable these conversations to take place in secrecy. The American device, which actually came into service, was absolutely huge. It weighed 40 tons and had 50 racks of sort of equipment on it, so it was not exactly small. So Alan Turing was put on a task by the UK government, which is, can we do it more efficiently? Can we do something smaller? And so he came up with this thing on the right, which is about the size of an Enigma machine, actually, which is his answer to the speech encipherment problem. So he worked on the theory of that. But that wasn't, you don't put a guy like Alan Turing as a mathematician on basically an engineering radio project like that. That's not really where his skill sets were. What he was really doing for the second half of the war was he'd moved over from being the code breaker to being the security guy. You know, he was looking at the security of the Allied communications, particularly transatlantic communications. So the speech encipherment's one part of that, but he was also looking at the security of Allied codes. So this is quite interesting. He's essentially poacher turned gamekeeper. And this role for him really has only come to light sort of very recently with some recently released public documents. So he goes back to Bletchley Park, and just to give you a feel for what Bletchley Park is like in 1943 when Alan Turing is changing his role. We've got essentially bomb factory. We've got a load of bombs setting up there with a load of very bored service women operating, and you look at this poor lady. It's a deeply, desperately dull job that she's got. She joined the Navy to meet sailors, and and well, the picture says it all, doesn't it? But the map's quite interesting as well, because that's a map of Bletchley Park in 1943. It doesn't look like a Victorian stately home with sort of a maze and beautiful gardens and stuff. You can see it's turned into an industrial complex. Look at all those buildings that have been thrown up by 1943. This is an intelligence factory now, and it just shows that the whole effort that was going on into production of intelligence from intercepted radio messages and how crucially important it was. But anyway, so do come. It's a very interesting place to visit. Okay, and I want to switch to the post-war period, where essentially what they learned at Bletchley Park was the importance of machinery for problem solving. And everybody, and on both sides of the Atlantic, was very keen to put all that they had learned during the war years into developing a real practical universal computing machine using the technological developments that had been put together during the war. And so Alan Turing went off to the National Physical Laboratory to devise Britain's sort of computer. There was going to be a national computer. And so he went off to design this, but it took forever being a government project, it took forever for the thing to materialise. It didn't actually materialise until 5 years after he died. So that's a sort of classic story of public projects. But again, Max Newman, this interesting character who planted this seed of thought on the mechanical process all those years before, comes back into the picture at this point, because he was one of the people at Bletchley Park who wanted to go off and create a computing laboratory. And he'd built a computer. And that's the picture of it. So although I've got 1949 as the date, I'll explain why in a second, but Max Newman had actually built a computer that by 1947 was actually solving problems. It's called the Manchester Baby, and that's a picture of it. And you can see the caption on that newspaper photograph says the mechanical brain. But there was also another newspaper caption called it a marvel of our time. It looks terrible, doesn't it? But anyway, it worked. It was amazing, so it worked. By 1949, Max Newman had done two things. First of all, he'd hired Alan Turing, who was very bored when his computer wasn't being built and didn't have anything to do. And secondly, he'd moved on from this Manchester Baby to a proper commercially built computer to Max Newman's, built to his design, on which you could actually do real problems. And this is what Alan Turing wanted to do. He didn't want to build computers. He actually wanted to use them for problem solving. And again, Max Newman is very influential in this, because Max Newman was a topologist. Okay, so what's topology? It's where it's the study of sort of shapes of things. And if you squeeze a tennis ball, can you turn it into a sausage shape and that kind of thing? And what happens to the pattern on the tennis ball, on the surface of the tennis ball when you squeeze it and that kind of thing? This is quite interesting, because Alan Turing at this point is making a move into biology, and he's studying the shape and form of things as they grow. To keep with the tennis ball idea, he observes that mammal embryos are spherical in shape, tennis ball shape. But then he says a horse is not a spherically symmetrical object. So how does the tennis ball know to turn itself into a head at one end, a tail at the other end, and put 4 legs and not 11 legs? And so how does it know how to do that? Is there some chemistry-based explanation for that? Can we model the behaviour of chemicals in that tennis ball or on the surface of the tennis ball to explain how it turns from a spherically symmetrical object into something as complex as a horse? And this is something that he can be tempted to think about, because Max Newman is a topologist. But Max Newman's also got a computing laboratory, which means that you can run the computer to solve your partial differential equations, which are too damned hard for people to solve using pencil and paper methods. So we've got a really interesting bunch of research coming up from Alan Turing, and he starts it off with this paper called The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, where he's able to account for things like the patterns that you observe on Frisian cows. I don't know, where in Europe, most of our milk comes from black and white splotchy cows called Frisians. I don't know whether that's true here as well. But so this pattern that you see on the back of in the background to the paper here, that's one of the diagrams from his paper, and he's able to have generated that pattern from his differential equations, which he was running on the computer. And if I can just have the link come up, please, then we'll be able to sort of. This is from a German professor called Felix Voitzel, who's managed to get a video of, I hope, of how the equations might work in real life. So it looks grey and featureless at the minute, but as you just let it run, you'll see that after a while, pattern is beginning to appear on the slide, and we can see blotches appearing, we can see shapes coming out, and that doesn't look grey and featureless anymore, and that's probably about it. So it won't get any more interesting than that. So if we can escape from that, we can get an escape from that, and we'll go back to the main slides. So, okay, thank you. So that's essentially what he was working on, and indeed the research project that was going to take him through for the rest of his life. Now, as Melissa said at the beginning, we've got the idea that Alan Turing had a very short life. He died at the age of 42, so he was still working on this biological problem. So we come to the final myth, really, which is the one about the uncaring state. And we all know that Alan Turing was prosecuted in 1952 for gross indecency, in other words, having homosexual relationships in private with another man. And he was sentenced to a course of hormone treatment, and there is quite clearly a link to that and his taking his own life 2 years later. So the final myth is, which is the one I think that is most interesting and can't be terribly easily exploded, is that an uncaring state failed to take any account of Alan Turing's contribution during the war and treated him unfairly and dismally in this process. Now, to some extent this is actually true, but to some extent it isn't true at all. Fact number one, Alan Turing was not the only person prosecuted on this particular day in 1952 for this kind of offence. In fact, about a quarter of the court's business over the 3-day assizes that were taking place was actually taken up with cases of men having had homosexual relations in private. So this is kind of like regular business for the courts in 1952. So it's not right to say that Alan Turing was somehow singled out for being prosecuted in this way. However, there are some things which were odd about the case. The first one that's odd is that you can already see from just this first page of the indictment there are 3 counts. The other guys who were prosecuted for this only had 1 count, which is that they had done this thing on a particular date. Alan Turing, there were 2 dates, so you might expect there to be 2 counts, but no, there were 8. So first was that he had done this thing with Arnold Murray on date 1. Second count, Arnold Murray had done it with him on date 1. Third count, that Alan had he had incited Arnold Murray to do it with him on date 1. And the fourth count, Arnold Murray had incited Alan to do it with him on date 1. And so you repeat the process for date 2. None of the other guys that were prosecuted had this kind of, fourfold attack on them. So that was interesting. Second difference is in the way that they were sentenced. Now, it might just have been because Alan was a professor and sort of somehow was supposed to have sort of known better, but I think actually this is not the explanation, but Alan was the only one that was sentenced to have this essentially hormone treatment. I don't think anybody in court realised that that was what was going to happen. They thought they'd found a clever legal loophole that would keep Alan out of prison and avoid him having to pay a fine, and therefore he'd be able to keep his job. And so I think, so far from it being an uncaring state trying to do the dirty on Alan Turing, I think it was actually quite the opposite. They had somebody from GCHQ come around to give evidence as a character witness. Max Newman stood up in the witness box and said how valuable his research was and what a vital contribution he'd made during the war and so forth. And the judge bought all this and said, OK, we'll go with this loophole thing, which is actually to put Alan Turing on probation on condition that he undergoes treatment for his condition. None of the other guys got that option. They were all fined or sent to prison. So actually, this treatment, which then turned out to be a bit more than going and seeing the psychiatrist, it turned into this hormone treatment that I don't think anybody realised was actually going to be part of the deal. I think that was probably an accident rather than a deliberate bending of justice. But anyway, it's still nevertheless true that he committed suicide a couple of years later, and while it's really hard to form a direct link to the hormone treatment, I think it's also equally hard to say that it played no role. Again, I thought you might just find these quite interesting because these are press cuttings from 1954, and they just show you that things haven't changed at all in the last 60 years. The way that the press sort of deals with things is actually it's quite amusing in a sort of slightly sad kind of way. You probably can't see this, but some of the headlines there, one on the top left-hand cutting says, "Did own cooking." I mean, that's because they'd found a saucepan with this sort of bubbling cyanide mix that he'd been making for himself, so did own cooking, you know. 1954, there's a man who does his own cooking. How shocking is that? You know, scientists took poison apparatus in room. You know, I mean, this is very sort of, you know, it's very 1950s, isn't it? And then scientist robot brain man is found dead, and then there's the photo, and you won't be able to read that because the print's far too small, but it says under the picture of Dr. Turing, where they got that picture from, I have no idea. He fed the brain. So, you know, I mean, it's classic sort of tabloid journalism. It's actually, as I say, in a sort of rather sad way, it's all quite amusing. All right, so that's the mythology of Alan Turing. Thank you very much for having me this evening, and thank you for listening so attentively. I am very happy to take questions.
Wait for us to bring a microphone to you. We are taping in the back of the room, and it's the only way the people at home who are watching can hear your questions. There's a question right over here.
Is there any evidence that he was autistic or had Asperger's?
Well, I'm not sure that I quite know what those things mean, so I'm not really able to answer the question. I mean, I guess your question probably comes from, again, Benedict's portrayal of Alan Turing in the movie, where one would sort of, it would be very easy to conclude from that way that he's presented the character that some of those labels might apply. But those labels are relatively recent inventions, and so I just don't think that we've got enough to go on. What I would say is that if you came away from the movie thinking that Alan Turing was friendless, so difficult to get on with, that he was sort of virtually impossible socially, and he was such a geek that he could only work on his own and that kind of thing. Those things, I would say, are probably false impressions, because from the people that I've talked to who worked with him, that is not the picture that they paint of Alan Turing. There are two Alan Turings, though. There's the Alan Turing who couldn't cope at a social gathering like a sherry party because, I mean, frankly, he found them boring and sort of distressing, and he was badly dressed, and I mean, we've all met professors who are a bit like that, and I'm kind of, but I'm not sure that putting labels around people just because they're awkward in some social situations and more at home in others is actually fair to them. I think it's better just to treat people as individuals, and so I think that's a better way to look at Alan Turing.
There's another question right here.
I don't know if this is on. In some material I read some time ago, there was an inspector of police that was accused of driving Alan Turing to suicide. Do you, and that the inspector was portrayed as an individual not knowing what the VC was or things of that nature. Is that true?
Not that I've been able to find out. Again, I did look into the policemen who were involved in Alan Turing's case, and I found nothing to indicate they'd done anything other than treat it just like the other cases that were coming through their police station at the time, other than this strange business about the four-pronged indictment, which I still find that hard to explain. It would require a lot more research to work out whether that was happening in other courts at the time. There were a number of other much higher profile defendants going through the criminal courts. People like Sir John Gielgud, the actor, was one who was prosecuted at roughly the same time. But I haven't checked whether that was different in his case. So, but I don't think there's any indication that the police. I mean, I haven't seen any evidence at all. I've seen a number of dramatisations which sort of include the thing that you've mentioned, but I haven't seen any evidence, and I haven't seen anything in any of the biographies to indicate that the police were doing anything other than what they believed to be a perfectly proper job.
There's a question right back there.
From a woman's point of view, in the movie, she played a very active part in his life. Was there that relationship? And if I recall, in the movie, she was the one that found him after his suicide. What do you have to say on that?
Okay, so this is the Keira Knightley person. Yes, there was a lady, she was called Joan Clark, and she was engaged to Alan Turing very briefly. They met at Bletchley Park. She was very clever mathematics. She went on to have a fairly distinguished career in mathematics. I'm not sure whether she was ever a professor, but she was certainly a very talented mathematician that Gordon Welshman, one of Alan Turing's colleagues at Bletchley Park, had spotted and recruited, and they worked together, and then they got engaged, and then Alan explained to her after a few months that his sexual orientation was not going to be compatible with a heterosexual marriage, and lots of people, don't forget, in the 1940s, lots of people just sort of got on with that anyway, but that wasn't neither of them thought that was the right thing to do, and so they split apart. But they did remain friends for the rest of Alan's life. I'm not sure they were particularly intimate. There's absolutely no suggestion that Joan Clark had anything to do with Alan's breakdown and suicide, and she certainly wasn't around at the time of that. So, no, she's a real live. Well, she's not with us anymore, but she's a real character, and so the story of them being engaged and together for a short while is actually true. Yes.
There's a question here in the front row.
I want to thank you for coming down tonight. Gives a better picture of what your uncle was really like. In the movie, Ian Cumberbatch's portrayal, how close to reality was that? His portrayal, of your uncle.
Well, I've explained that I think that to some extent it's a bit overdone in terms of the you get a sense of somebody who's socially completely impossible, sort of doesn't know when he's being invited to lunch. That I think that's overdone. I mean, I can see where Benedict sort of got that from, but the people who he worked with at Bletchley Park said, their personal impressions were quite the opposite, actually, and saying how helpful he was and explaining stuff to them, and so I think the idea of somebody who's isolated and friendless isn't a fair picture at all. What you do get from the movie, which I think is completely authentic, is the sort of sense of drama and tension about the breaking of the Enigma codes and how challenging that was, and how they needed these brilliant insights of something like a machine to break a machine and that kind of stuff, and how really it was touch and go. I mean, they've taken it they've over dramatized it, but the core thread of the story is still true. That we're only like a quarter of a step ahead of the Germans. Every time the Germans kept making changes, and then British would just about catch up. And so there really is, that's all true. And the chase of the U-boats, that's all true. And so I think you can perhaps criticize it too much, because the job of Hollywood is not to write documentaries. We wouldn't go to the movies if they churned out sort of factually accurate documentaries with lots of footnotes and sort of nuances explained. We wouldn't tolerate that. So that's not their job. Their job is to give you a great evening out. So and I have to say, I think they've got to come up with a really good mix there. But we're intelligent people, and so we're not going to go to the movies and expect to be given a documentary. There's a nice channel on Sky that you can go and see that kind of stuff. So.
Addison, I think Linda has a question.
Thank you, Sir Dermot, for being here. What I would like to ask you, to get away from the movies, what has instigated you to write this biography, please?
No, it's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. I'm not going to pretend to be the first person who's written a biography of Alan Turing. Alan Turing's main biographer, Andrew Hodges, came out with his book 30 years ago, just over 30 years ago. And we discovered quite a lot more about him since then. Has been mentioned earlier, there's been quite a few releases of previously secret documents, and also what's been quite interesting, I think, in the course of that 30-year period is a lot of people who had known Alan Turing but hadn't previously sort of thought there was anything interesting in the fact that they'd known Alan Turing, had given various interviews to local press and and so forth, and so actually we get a much better picture of him 30 years on than you wouldn't expect this, because you'd expect that the fresher it is, the more accurate it would be. But actually sort of people have come forward with stuff, and so actually there's a lot more that we know about him, a lot more we know about what he'd been up to. So I thought that was worth sort of getting that across as well. And also I have to say, I think that some of the biographical stuff out there, it's kind of indigestible to the general public. I'm not a mathematician, so I'm going to be the first person to tell you that reading uncomputable numbers with an application to the Entscheidungs problem is not exactly sort of unputdownable thriller Len Dayton style reading. So let's hand the story back to the public in a way that a non-mathematician would tell it. So I wanted to do that. And then actually, I've been bothered about some of these myths. Some of those myths that I put up in my 5-myth sort of story of Alan Turing is that some of those myths are not in the movie. So they're myths that have been out there for some time anyway. And again, so I kind of wanted to explode those. So that's a long and complicated answer, but it's a good question. Thank you.
I think there's a question right back there.
Yeah, how did he develop this kind of mechanical, mathematical modeling kind of thinking process? Back in the 1920s and 30s, it must have been rather unusual. And for him to have grown up and to learn those skills to develop stuff and then come up with an actual functional model by 1939. How did he get there?
Yeah, no, that's a good one as well. And again, I don't know, but I can imagine, based on my own experience growing up with my father. They both went to the same prep school. Sorry, in the UK, a prep school is what you go to before you go to a thing called a public school, and both of those phrases have completely different meanings on my side of the pond. So, okay, so these are private boarding schools for boys, and aged 8 to 13 it's called a prep school, aged 13 to 18 it's called a public school. We won't go into the complicated, stupid reasons for that, but anyway, so a prep school. So we're 8 to 13, okay? So the 8 to 13s, they're in a very small school, and the headmaster has a very hands-on, practical approach. He wants his boys to leave school with manual skills as well as intellectual ones. And I'm not just talking about rugby and cricket. I mean, that's very important too, but they have carpentry lessons. And it's very interesting. You read the end-of-term school magazine where all the achievements of all the boys are sort of listed, and the football matches, the results are all there. And there are 2 pages every term devoted to carpentry. And my father retained his very bad carpentry skills for the whole of his life. So we had homemade furniture. He used to build homemade buildings out of bricks in the backyard, and they were a bit wobbly. But the whole idea was that it was all practical. You had to be able to do it yourself. And Alan definitely had this same psychological trait in him, that it wasn't somehow good enough if you couldn't have a go at doing it yourself. And so when he started working on making analog machines, there was one that he started on when he was at Princeton, which was to solve a mathematical problem called the Riemann zeta function, which involved having cogwheels that had a prime number of teeth, different prime numbers for the different cogwheels. So these are very complicated things, very difficult to manufacture. So he took an engineering student friend of his down to the lab, and of course his engineering student friend had a key to the manufacturer's workshop at the back of the engineering lab. And they spent the nights milling teeth for these for this machine. I mean, just the most extraordinary kind of thing. So it was all very hands-on. It was hands-on from day one, doing your own experiments, making your own machines. And I think, having had this idea of a mechanical process, it probably just triggered some kind of thing in his head. We say, well, if it's a mechanical process, I can do that. Or even if I can't do it, I can have a go. And so I think the whole sort of realization of ideas in physical form probably was there right from the outset. And I think that that's the prep school headmaster we probably have to thank for that.
There was a question way in the back over there.
The work that he was doing in what I guess you could describe as computational biology, I mean, that would appear to be a precursor of the development of the genome.
Yes, well, all right. I'm at risk of getting extremely boring about this, so I will have to be sort of restrained in a moment. But it's no coincidence that Alan Turing's paper on the chemical theory of morphogenesis comes out in 1952. Watson and Crick's paper on the structure of DNA comes out very shortly afterwards. And suddenly the world of developmental biology has shifted into a different place as a result of Watson and Crick's discovery. For the next 40 years, roughly, the only funding that's going to be given to research biologists is DNA-based. I mean, I did this when I for a very short period, studied genetics, and what you did was you did DNA-based work. If you were interested in the same problems that Alan Turing was interested in, why is a horse not a spherically symmetrical object, you only got a grant for it because you were doing DNA-related studies, which is actually like a tenth of the picture, actually. And actually, in the 21st century, biologists have been rediscovering things like the late 19th century biologists' approach to these kinds of problems, and they've also rediscovered Alan Turing's equations, and they've started getting research grants to pursue his work further. But there was this like 40-year gap where you were only allowed to do DNA. Sorry, that's the short version, but it's probably good enough.
We actually have time for one more question, and we're going to go way in the back of the room there.
Good evening. Did your uncle have any contact with his counterparts in Germany after the war, and were you able to speak to anybody in Germany?
So the answer to your second question is, well, I have spoken to some people in Germany, but not any of the German code breakers, because I don't think any of them are still with us. But those of you who are interested in that particular question should visit the National Cryptologic Museum, which is at Fort George G. Meade, where David Kahn's collection of research and his interview notes with the German code breakers are all collected there, because he gave his stuff to that museum. So it's really interesting. But actually, I'm afraid that's the geek answer. The first question you asked, which is, what did Alan Turing know about the German code breakers, and was he in any way connected with them after the war? He was, actually, and this is something that, again, has come to surface from secret archives only in the course of the last sort of 18 months. We knew from some interviews that had been done many years ago that Alan Turing had made a visit to Germany in 1945, but what the purpose of it was remained a bit obscure, and that's what's actually been clarified recently. He was sent to, there's a sort of silly story around this, but he was sent to a secret German laboratory where they were doing a whole load of work on things, including making a speech encipherment machine and producing their own high-quality replacement for things like Enigma to do higher security message transmission. And he was sent with another famous Bletchley Park person called Tommy Flowers, who some of you may have heard of, and they were both sent to this place to check out what had been going on in this laboratory. But I think apart from that, Alan Turing probably had no connection, no contact with German code breakers or cryptologists in any way. Right, now I intrigued you, didn't I, by saying there's a silly story around Alan Turing's trip to Germany. Okay. In order to go to Germany in 1945, you had to have a travel permit from one of the occupying powers, and the relevant laboratory was in US occupied part of Germany. So Alan Turing needed a travel permit signed by the US Army. And the officer that signed his travel permit was a guy called Lieutenant Edward I. Frankenstein. Now, that's not the silly story. The silly story is that when Alan Turing is required to report on his mission to this secret laboratory, he starts his report by saying, it's a classic German fantasy castle. You can just imagine it's Frankenstein's castle with a robot peering out of the window at you, and you're thinking, oh God, you shouldn't have said that. So his report was suppressed. Actually, his report was suppressed because actually there was an American officer who wrote a much better report. It was like 20 pages long and actually went through everything in detail. So Alan Turing's stupid Frankenstein report really wasn't necessary, but it would probably have caused offence. So I think it was probably a good thing it was suppressed until last year. Anyway, that's probably a good note to finish on.
Great way to end. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
He has been so kind to stay here, and as long as he needs to sign all your books. If you haven't already bought one and now you're intrigued and you know you need to buy one, there's for sale right here in this back corner. We just ask that you remain seated just for a second because we're going to line you up through this hallway, so you don't have to go outside, and we just need to sneak by before you go out. So wait just 1 minute, and staff will start you going through the book sign line. Thank you all for being here today.